Welcome to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Right now, we're going through the entire Bible to understand it as one big, cohesive story. We're covering one book each day, and this one's about 1 Chronicles.
Hey, my friends, it's Matt. And just like Camilla was saying a second ago, we're going to talk about 1 Chronicles today. But I got to tell you, this is the hardest one I've done so far. And it's hard for a couple of reasons. One, because this book was difficult for me to read. I was humming reading all the other books before I would record these episodes, but it has not been a burden. It's just been fun so far. Because I'm catching all kinds of things I hadn't caught before. And I know I'm saying it at like the end of every single episode, but I am learning so much. And I'm just having a blast with this until 1 Chronicles. First of all, it opens with 9 straight chapters of genealogy. And look, I've read the Bible and I've thought about this stuff a little bit, and I understand the genealogies are there for a reason, and I even feel comfortable talking about why they're there, but that doesn't change the fact that it is hard to sit down and just read through those names, most of which I can't pronounce. And I should probably know a lot more of them, but I don't because I forget things. And so it's just a lot of unfamiliar material there. But then once I got to the end of that, I'm like, okay, there we go. Good. All right, now let's move forward. But you don't move forward in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. What you get is a gigantic recap of stuff that you already looked at. And so it's the first time in the Bible, other than the little aside that is Ruth, but even Ruth still feels like you're moving ahead chronologically. It's the first time as you're doing a trip straight through the Bible where stuff is not happening in order anymore. And just straight up, that can be kind of discouraging. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, on the one hand, if you've ever tried to read through the Bible and 1st and 2nd Chronicles were difficult, hey, I feel you. It was difficult for me, and recording this follow-up summary episode has been abnormally difficult for me as well because I'm out of rhythm. We're not going through a narrative anymore. It's hard. I don't know what to do. This is like my 5th try at it. Thankfully, you'll never have to hear the wreckage of all of the other tries. But even though I acknowledge and totally empathize with you if you have found 1st and 2nd Chronicles to be difficult if you're reading along, I also want to try to sell you on why I think they're awesome. And there's something really brilliant going on here that I don't think I've ever appreciated until this trip through. Let me liken it to this. Have you ever watched a streaming TV show where you queue up the first episode of a new season and it gives you a recap of a bunch of stuff from all of the previous seasons? Usually, I find those to be helpful, but I'm in a hurry to get it over with. Yeah, I don't want to go watch all 36 one-hour episodes of the show to get back up to speed. So I'm grateful for the plot beats and the characters and like, okay, yeah, that happened, that's right. And what were the big questions that were still hanging out there? What are the points of tension? Okay, there you go. Thank you, recap. We're done here. Let's move on. But I've seen a couple of those recaps that were really good. I mean, that recap, it's just a tiny little percentage of all the material that's out there to be drawn from. But on the really good ones, the editing is so masterful that it not only reminds me of plot beats and all of that, but it helps me see a theme that is there, but was really hard to catch when I was going through it all in real time because there's just so much material. And then the recap, boom, it opened my eyes to it. And all of a sudden I'm like, oh, this is even better than I thought it was. That is the experience I'm having right now with 1st and 2nd Chronicles. It is pointing something out to me, the reader, who thinks he pretty much got everything there was to get from all of that. Yeah, I get the gist. 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel. I think I'm tracking with you. It's pointing out to me that there's stuff that I missed. And it's also pointing out to the original audience, hey, you think you know this story and where it's at, but there's actually something even better going on here. Okay, there's my little teaser for why 1st and 2nd Chronicles are awesome. Let's get into a few of the details here. 1st and 2nd Chronicles, like 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Samuel before it, was originally one document, maybe written by Ezra. We don't know for sure who put pen to paper on this, other than we can tell from internal evidence that it was probably somebody involved in the priestly side of things. And we can deduce pretty easily that it was written sometime after 539 BC because it mentions Cyrus the Great, the first emperor of Persia, by name. Probably it was written somewhere in the 400s BC. Maybe we'll talk more about that tomorrow. Maybe we won't. But as we've discussed before, Chronicles, Kings, and Samuel had to be cut into 2 books because of changes in recording, writing technology. But there's nothing nefarious about those divisions at all, in the same way that there's nothing nefarious about how you manage your data differently now that you've got multi-terabyte micro SD cards versus the 1 gigabyte and change floppy disks you used to use back in the day. Media technology changes things, nothing weird going on there. But if you have to add a division because of scroll length after the fact, it's nice to put those divisions in good places. Samuel achieves that by ending 1 Samuel on the cliffhanger with Saul's death. How are things going to work out with David? Find out in 2 Samuel. Kings does the same thing. We've had this grand drama that's dominated the last chunk of this book between the prophet Elijah and the wicked king of the north, Ahab, and now that's kind of resolved. What's going to happen in 2 Kings with the prophet Elijah's successor and these other awful kings of the north and mediocre kings of the south? Well, 1st and 2nd Chronicles divides very neatly as well, because the whole unified book really only has 3 parts. Part 1 is this 9-chapter genealogy that I referenced a little bit ago. It is a bit of a slog, but as we look closer, we discover that it's pretty rad, and it actually introduces a big theological thesis statement. So that's part 1. Then chapter 10 through the end of 1 Chronicles is part 2. And that is a very flattering, very positive look at the reign of King David. And then that comes to an end. And then almost all of 2 Chronicles is a summary of the deeds of the good kings of the southern kingdom of Judah. And then a little tiny detail at the end that involves Cyrus and Persia that we'll get to tomorrow when we look a little more closely at 2 Chronicles. The first 4 English letters of 1 Chronicles are A-D-A-M. It starts that crisply with a genealogy. And as you go through it, you're going to catch some of these names. And whether you've looked closely at the Bible or just starting to familiarize yourself with it, there'll be a few of these that are going to pop. And you'll be like, oh, I know the story that goes along with that guy. That makes me think of this and this. And it's meant to make you think of those people and what they did. It's also meant to make you think of how God is and what he did in that particular situation. I mean, the big take home of this grand genealogy is look how up and down people are, but look at how faithful God is through the whole thing. We've seen some pretty low times here, original audience, to Chronicles, but God has held up his end of the bargain the entire time. He's been faithful even when we've been faithless. And he's blessed us in great abundance when we've done what he told us to do per the terms of the deal, the covenant that is, that he made with Moses. So I think there are really 3 through lines of genealogy here in these first 9 chapters. One is just the big grand picture. It's just Adam, and then on down to Abraham, and then Abraham's famous descendants, and then on down to David, and then forward from David's descendants. It's just the big grand list of the chosen people, family, and it's a reminder that there is a redemptive plan and that all the nations are going to be blessed through this nation, through these descendants of Abraham, per the terms of the covenant with Abraham back in Genesis chapter 12. But then in chapter 2, we get a more specific genealogy where we zoom in on David. And I think this is the second through line genealogy because David, of course, is a regal genealogy. And so we look backwards from David and we look forwards from David. And here we get one name that I don't think that gets mentioned in Kings or Samuel, and that is a guy named Zerubbabel, who we're going to hear more about as we go forward into Ezra and Nehemiah here in a couple of days. But this is a big deal because he's the guy who should be king if there was no Babylon and there was no Persia and there was no exile and the kingdom of Judah hadn't fallen. This would be the guy. And he returns from exile. So this return of the king is a really big deal because the fact that that name pops right there to you and me, it just looks like a bunch of B's and Z's and is very confusing, like maybe it's a punchline of a joke. But to the original audience, they would be like that's the guy. That's the guy who is carrying forward the promise in his blood. He really, really matters, and he was there. Now we have more than a hint of hope. We got some legitimate hope cooking. More on that in a minute. Then you've got this third genealogy that looks back toward Aaron, the brother of Moses. and forward all the way through the priests at the time that this book was written. And this is a priestly genealogy. And so what you got is these three genealogies, I think, weaving together all of these very disparate stories to create, once it's all assembled, this beautiful tapestry that tells the story of God's redemptive plan and the various elements that are going to make it up. Those being God's chosen people, this royal lineage, and the priesthood that at this time is serving as the go-between between God and man. So if somebody back in the day is reading those 9 chapters of genealogy much more attentively than I'm capable of, they would probably pretty quickly be like, oh, the author of Chronicles is saying there's hope, and these are the 3 threads historically through which we can see God working that hope out. From chapter 10 through the end of 1 Chronicles, then you get this story of David. And as you read through it, you'll notice really quickly that pretty much everything bad about David is omitted. Now, I don't think the author of Chronicles here is like, oh, I hope they forget all of that stuff. And there's the Bathsheba and the murder thing. And, oh, man, we just need to purge that from history. No, I mean, within Chronicles, there are references to all these other documents that we no longer have about summaries of the lives of kings. And obviously, Samuel would have been in circulation at this point as well. The author of Chronicles knows that everybody knows the story of David. They can go and look that stuff up. He's not fooling anybody by trying to reframe David as a better guy than he was. No, what he's doing here is a theological history that's meant to paint a picture of an ideal king. So the theological centerpiece of 1 Chronicles, as it just happens to divide up, is in chapter 17, where we get a recap of the covenant that God made with David, the one where David's like, hey, God, this is awesome. I'm going to build you a temple. And God's like, nope, I'm going to have one of your descendants do that, but I'm going to build for you a royal house. And then he effectively explains that there's going to be this great king, and this great king is going to reign forever. And when we look at a bunch of other details about the Messiah from around the Old Testament, it becomes very clear the promise is the Messiah is going to come from you. So then what we get are a whole bunch of little vignettes of an ideal king, little hints of what it would look like if all the best elements of David's kingship were retained and all of the stupid stuff was not retained. But what we can safely say by the time we get to the end of 1 Chronicles and compare it with 1 and 2 Samuel, which is overwhelmingly what 1 Chronicles is a summary of, is that Samuel is putting pretty heavy emphasis on the stuff that went wrong, both with Saul, who barely even gets any mention in 1 Chronicles, and even within David's own reign, which gets quite a lot of screen time, especially in 2 Samuel. What we're getting back there is a close look at what happens when God's chosen people don't obey his commands per the terms of the deal that God made with Moses. Well, God will punish them. God will correct them. That's what he said he was going to do. What we're getting from Samuel and then on into Kings is a description of how we got into this mess in the first place. Here's what went wrong. But what we're starting to see take shape in 1 Chronicles, and this will be carried through into 2 Chronicles, is that the chronicler is telling us, here's what we need to emulate if we want to get it right now that God is giving us another crack at this. Now that we're in rebuilding mode, now that we can look forward to the dynasty of David being reestablished, here's the beautiful stuff that needs to be carried forward. Here's what we can do and lean into to make sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. So there is an inherent optimism here. Everything is being reframed and recast in light of the faithfulness of God to work through these broken people and to twist their stories together into this beautiful mosaic. What we are seeing unfold before us is a masterful recap of everything that we just watched in painstaking detail that shows us that it's not so much a glimmer of hope as much as it is gigantically well-placed optimism to believe that this redemptive plan is still on and that God is still going to deliver. So let the reader look forward with optimism and hope and anticipation of what God is still going to do. And if you only have time to read one part of 1 Chronicles, make it 1 Chronicles 17, where you get a review of God's covenant with David. And there it is. Achievement unlocked. 1 Chronicles. Congratulations. You just leveled up again. This was a hard-earned level up for me, but I really enjoyed it, and I'm excited for a much easier conversation about 2 Chronicles mañana. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.
This podcast is supported by many of you at patreon.com/the TMPH podcast. We're grateful because it supports our family.